A millionaire spends 5 years at the side of his wife in a coma, while the best doctors in the world have already given up all hope. One afternoon in the hospital, a poor 6-year-old girl quietly enters the room and whispers, "Uncle, I know how to bring her out of the coma." He thinks it's a cruel joke, but what she did next shocked the entire hospital. The rain beat against the panoramic window of the hospital room, a persistent weeping that echoed the sorrow that had settled in Arthur Sinclair's heart for exactly 5 years. From the 12th floor, the city was a blur of melancholy lights, a world that kept spinning, indifferent to his private paralysis. The room's antiseptic smell, a mix of rubbing alcohol and disinfectant, tried in vain to overcome the perfume of the white gardenias he replaced every morning, Helena's favorites. They were the only touch of life, of color, in a universe dominated by sterile white and the rhythmic, merciless beep of the monitors. That sound was the metronome of his despair, a beat marking every second of his penance. He held her hand, a hand that had once been so full of life, that gestured with passion when telling a story, that caressed him with tenderness. Nodi, it was just a fragile, pale object, unresponsive to his touch. Helena's face, as serene as a porcelain doll's, showed no sign of the vibrant woman he loved. Only the gentle rise and fall of her chest, commanded by machines, confirmed that she was still there, or at least part of her was. Arthur felt the weight of his expensive suit on his shoulders, a useless armor against the pain that corroded him from within. The fortune he'd amassed, which allowed him to keep Helena in the finest suite of the country's most advanced medical center, felt like an insult. What good was having everything if he couldn't buy a single blink of her eyes? Guilt was his most faithful companion, a constant whisper in his mind. If I hadn't stormed out like that, if I had swallowed my pride and listened to what she had to say. The argument, so foolish and insignificant now, replayed in his memory like a form of torture. He'd stood up, slammed the door, and driven off with no destination, his heart heavy with anger. He never knew that Helena, desperate, had taken her car to follow him, only to meet an out-of-control truck in her path. Every beep from the monitor was an accusation. He leaned in, his face close to hers, his stubble brushing against her soft skin. "Forgive me, my love," he whispered, as he did every day. "I would trade everything, absolutely everything, to go back to that night." It was then that a subtle movement at the door made him lift his head. Standing in the threshold, like a small apparition, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6, dressed in a simple, slightly worn coat, her dark hair in 2 uneven pigtails. Her large brown eyes were fixed on Helena with an intensity that unsettled him. Arthur frowned, irritation beginning to bubble beneath the surface of his grief. How had a child gotten in here? Security was strict. She had probably gotten lost from a family member on another floor. He prepared to call a nurse to handle it with the cold efficiency that now governed his life. But before he could say a word, the girl took a step into the room, the sound of her canvas sneakers nearly inaudible on the polished floor. She looked at him, not with fear, but with an unusual seriousness for her age. Then, her voice, soft and clear, cut through the heavy silence of the room. "Mister," she said, "I know how to wake her up." Arthur's world stopped. Disbelief came first, followed by a wave of anger. What kind of cruel prank was this? He opened his mouth to scold her, to demand she leave, but something held him back. The girl approached the bed and, instead of speaking further, began to hum. It was a simple, childish melody he had never heard before. A lullaby that didn't belong in this place of machines and silence. Her eyes were fixed on Helena, and for an instant, time seemed to stretch. Arthur was about to finally intervene, his heart tight with this bizarre and painful intrusion, when a sharp, unexpected sound broke the room's monotony. He whipped his head toward the monitors. The line measuring Helena's heart rate, for 5 years a monotonous and predictable wave, had jumped a sharp, impossible spike that defied all medical logic. The shrill sound of the alarm pierced the bubble of silence and pain that enveloped Arthur. For a moment, he was paralyzed, his wide eyes fixed on the green line that was now descending, returning to its slow, familiar rhythm. But the spike, that steep and impossible mountain, was seared into his retina. The door burst open and two nurses rushed in, their faces tense with concern. One ran to the bed, checking the electrodes on Helena's chest, while the other analyzed the data on the monitor. "What happened?" the older one asked, her voice firm but not accusatory. Arthur could barely form a response. He just pointed, a trembling gesture, at the little girl who remained standing by the bed, her large, serene eyes still fixed on Helena, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. The nurse followed his gaze, her expression shifting from professionalism to pure confusion. "A child? How did she get in here?" But there was no time for answers. Dr. Mendes, the head neurologist who had been on the case since day one, entered the room, his face grim. He examined the monitor, then Helena's vitals. It was an artifact on the monitor, he declared after a few seconds that felt like an eternity to Arthur. A momentary interference. Her other vitals are stable. No changes. Arthur felt a bucket of ice water thrown over the tiny spark of hope that had ignited in his chest. "It wasn't an artifact," he said, his voice hoarse. The girl was singing, and her heart, it reacted." Dr. Mendes looked at the child, then at Arthur, with an expression of professional compassion that Arthur had grown to hate. "It was the look you gave a man grasping at straws. Arthur, I understand your desire to see an improvement, but after 5 years, an isolated spike like this is likely an autonomic spasm or, as I said, a technical glitch. It doesn't mean anything." Each word was a blow, an attempt to push him back into conformity, into the grim acceptance that nothing would change. The medical team withdrew, promising to check the equipment, leaving behind a silence even heavier than before. The girl was still there, motionless. Arthur turned to her, his heart a chaotic mix of desperate hope and frustrated anger. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice lower, but charged with an urgency that frightened him. "How did you know that song?" The girl just looked at him, her head tilted slightly. "It's her song," she answered with a disarming simplicity. "She likes it." The answer made no sense. But before Arthur could press her, his eyes were drawn back to Helena's face. He moved closer, searching, pleading for another sign, for anything that would prove the doctor wrong, that he wasn't going crazy. Her face remained the same, a mask of tranquility. Disappointment was a bitter taste in his mouth. Maybe the doctor was right. Maybe it was just his own longing, projecting miracles where there was only biology and machines. He sighed, the weight of the world falling back onto his shoulders. He was about to turn away, to accept defeat once more, when he noticed something, a subtle, minuscule glint in the corner of Helena's right eye. He held his breath, his heart stopping in his chest. Slowly, impossibly slowly, a single tear formed, welled up, and then broke free, sliding down her temple, tracing a wet, shining path on her pale skin. The tear was real. Arthur touched it with his fingertip, feeling the cool dampness against his skin. It wasn't an illusion, not a reflection from the lamp. It was salt. It was water. It was a response he had waited for 1,126 days. With a trembling hand, he pressed the nurse's call button, his eyes fixed on the glistening track on Helena's skin, afraid it would evaporate, taking that flicker of hope with it. Dr. Mendes returned, the same look of professional patience on his face, but this time his composure felt like an affront to Arthur. "She cried," Arthur said, his voice choked, pointing to his wife's face. "After the song, after the monitor, she cried, 'You have to see.'" The doctor leaned over, took a sterile gauze pad, and gently touched Helena's temple. He examined the damp fabric under the bright light. "Arthur," he began, in the carefully modulated tone he used for delivering bad news, "this is what we call a reflex secretion. The lacrimal nerve can be stimulated autonomously, without any conscious involvement. It's like a twitch, a bodily reflex. It doesn't indicate an emotional response." The explanation was logical, scientific, and it crushed Arthur's hope like an iron fist. He looked from the doctor to the girl, who watched the scene in silence, and then back to Helena. "It wasn't a reflex," he insisted, desperation coloring his voice. "It was because of her, because of the music." Dr. Mendez placed a sympathetic hand on his shoulder. "I know this is hard, but clinging to false hope will only make it more painful in the long run. We'll continue to monitor, as always. If there's any real change, you'll be the first to know." And with that, he was gone, leaving Arthur once again alone on his island of pain, now with the enigmatic company of the child. The door closed, and the ensuing silence was heavy with the disbelief of the outside world. Arthur felt like a madman, a fool. But he had seen it. He had felt it. And that was more real than any diagnosis. He knelt before the girl, ignoring the ache in his knees. He needed to understand. "Please," he begged, his voice low. "Who are you? How do you know about her?" The girl didn't answer his question. Instead, her gaze shifted to Helena's legs, covered by the pristine white sheet. She held out a small finger and pointed. "She didn't like to wear dresses in the summer," the girl said, her voice as soft as a whisper. "And because of the scar on her knee, the one that looks like a little moon." The air left Arthur's lungs. He felt a wave of vertigo, as if the floor had vanished beneath him. The scar, a small crescent-shaped mark on Helena's left knee, the result of a fall from a bike when she was 8. It was an intimate story, a tiny imperfection that Helena detested, but that he adored because it was part of her. A story she had only told him during a night of shared secrets. Years ago, information impossible to find anywhere. He stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs, 100 questions forming in his mind. But before he could voice a single one, the girl turned toward the door. "I have to go now," she said with the same unnerving calm. "My grandma will be worried." "Wait," he yelled, jumping to his feet. "Don't go. I need to... What's your name?" But she was already in the hallway. He ran to the door, but the corridor was empty. She had vanished as silently as she had appeared, leaving behind the echo of an impossible secret and a man whose reality had just been shattered. The hallway was deserted. Arthur ran to the elevator, then to the nurse's station, his heart pounding wildly. "A little girl," he said to the head nurse, his voice sounding more desperate than he intended. About 6 years old, beige coat, pigtails. "She was just here." The nurse looked at him with that same tired compassion. "Mr. Sinclair, there are no children registered to visit this floor today. Security is very strict." He insisted, described her again, but no one had seen her enter or leave. Security guards reviewed the footage from the hallways and elevators. Nothing. It was as if the girl had materialized from thin air and then dissolved back into it. He returned to the room, feeling like a fool. The echo of the doctor's words, false hope, buzzing in his ears. Had he imagined it all? The voice, the song, the scar. Was it possible his grief had finally fractured his sanity? He looked at Helena, searching for confirmation, but her face was the same blank canvas as always. The tear had dried. The monitors issued their monotonous, steady beep. That spike of activity, the tear, the intimate knowledge. It all felt like a fever dream, dissipating under the cold light of hospital reality. The next day dawned grey and rainy, mirroring Arthur's mood. He didn't leave Helena's side, his eyes fixed on her face, waiting, praying for another sign. But there was nothing. The small window of hope that had opened the day before was now shut and locked. The regression was subtle, but to him, who knew every nuance of that silence, it was glaring. There was a deeper stillness to her, an absence that felt more final. The involuntary muscle twitches that occasionally occurred had lessened. The rhythm of her breathing, controlled by the machine, seemed heavier. It was as if the small flame the girl had lit had been completely extinguished by her departure. By the second morning, the silence was a physical entity, pressing in on him, suffocating him. The guilt returned with full force. Maybe he should have held the girl, forced her to stay, to explain. He had let her go, and with her, perhaps Helena's only chance. He spent the hours talking to his comatose wife, telling her about the mysterious girl, repeating the melody he could barely remember, his voice tuneless and pathetic in the sterile room. No response. On the third day, hope was a distant, painful memory. Arthur felt drained, defeated. The gardenias in the vase were beginning to wilt, their edges browning, and he hadn't the strength to change them. He leaned back in the armchair, his body aching from the vigil, and closed his eyes. Maybe Dr. Mendez had been right all along. Maybe it was all just cruel coincidences, pieces his desperate brain had tried to fit together to form a miracle. Bitter acceptance began to set in. 5 years of waiting. What were a few more days of delusion? He was about to surrender to sleep, to give in to the exhaustion consuming him, when a nearly imperceptible sound made him open his eyes. The room door clicked softly shut. Standing there, in the exact same spot, wearing the same beige coat and with the same serious eyes, was her, the girl. The relief that flooded Arthur was so overwhelming, it left him breathless. She didn't say a word. She just walked to Helena's bed, looked at the woman's serene face, and once more began to hum the soft, childish melody. Arthur held his breath, his heart in his throat, and then it happened. The sound of the heart monitor changed. It wasn't an isolated spike, a shrill alarm. It was a steady, rhythmic acceleration, like a heart waking from a long slumber. Then, the monitor that measured brain activity, for years a landscape of slow, lazy waves, exploded into a symphony of lights and complex patterns, a neurological storm the doctors had never recorded. The frantic glow of the brain waves on the screen was mesmerizing. Arthur stood, his body tense, not daring to blink. This wasn't a spike, it was a tempest. An intense, sustained activity that contradicted 5 years of bleak prognoses. The girl finished her song and placed her small hand on Helena's, which rested inertly on the sheet. The silence that followed was no longer empty but charged with a palpable electricity, an expectation that made the air vibrate. The door opened again, but this time it wasn't alarm nurses. It was Dr. Mendez, making his morning rounds. He stopped abruptly at the scene, a transfixed Arthur, the mysterious girl by the bedside, and, most shockingly, the readings on the monitors. His eyes widened, his professional composure dissolving into pure stupefaction. He approached the machines, checking the connections, tapping the buttons, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "And this is," he began, his voice an incredulous whisper, "this is impossible." He looked at Arthur, then at the girl, and the doubt on his face was replaced by an intense scientific curiosity. What happened in here? Arthur, still stunned, could only point to the girl. She came back, and she started singing again. Dr. Mendez crouched to the child's level, his skepticism giving way to a cautious fascination. "Hello, what's your name?" he asked, his voice gentle. The girl stared at him with her serious eyes and didn't answer. Her attention was solely on Helena. The doctor, realizing he would get no answers there, turned to the staff who were beginning to gather at the door, drawn by the unusual activity. "Prep for an emergency EEG. I want a full brain map now, and I want these readings compared against the last 5 years of data. I want to know what's happening." The room, once a sanctuary of silence, transformed into a hive of activity. Technicians arrived with equipment, nurses adjusted sensors, and Arthur felt like a spectator in his own life, pushed to the side while science desperately tried to catch up to a miracle. The girl, unfazed by the chaos, remained by Helena's side, holding her hand. Hours later, the dust had settled. The room was quiet again, save for the now faster, more complex beeps of the monitors. Dr. Mendez entered, holding a series of charts and a tablet. His face was no longer one of compassion or skepticism, but of pure bewilderment. He sat across from Arthur. "I don't know how to explain this," he said, without preamble. "Helena's brainwaves. They're not just active, they're organized. The patterns we recorded while this girl was here, especially when she was singing, they're extraordinary." He turned the tablet to Arthur, showing 2 colorful brain scans. "This is the pattern of a person in a deep coma, minimal, disorganized activity. And this," he pointed to the other, "is what we recorded today. See these areas in red and orange? That's activity in the temporal lobe and the limbic system, areas associated with hearing, memory, and emotion." He paused as if to give his next words weight. "But there's something else. Something our neuroscience team is calling anomalous." He swiped the screen, revealing another graph. When we compared Helena's brainwave patterns to our database, we found a nearly identical match. But it's not with another coma patient, or even a healthy adult. He looked directly into Arthur's eyes. "The patterns are consistent with those observed in mothers who are in direct interaction with their newborn infants. It's a pattern of maternal connection." The doctor's words hung in the air, dense and incomprehensible. Maternal connection. Arthur looked at Helena, the woman he knew intimately, the woman with whom he'd shared dreams, fears, and every secret. One thing he knew with absolute certainty: Helena had never had children. They had talked about it years ago. She wanted to, someday, so did he. But the time never seemed right. His career was taking off. Her art gallery demanded all her attention. Someday, they always said. A someday that never came. That doesn't make sense. "Doctor," Arthur said, his voice weak, "Helena isn't a mother. We never had kids." Dr. Mendez ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration and confusion. "I know, Arthur, I know. It's what the data shows. I'm not saying it's logical, I'm saying it's what her brain is doing. It's a neurological response that defies everything we know about her condition. This child's presence is activating neural circuits that, in theory, shouldn't be so prominent or even exist in such an organized way." Arthur's head was spinning. The girl, who had been sitting on a small stool a nurse had brought, stood up. She didn't seem to have heard or understood the complex conversation. But she sensed the shift in the atmosphere. She walked to the door. "I have to go," she said, the same phrase as before, in the same calm tone. This time, Arthur wouldn't let her get away. He moved quickly, gently blocking her path. "Wait," he said, kneeling before her again. "Please, just one more thing. What's your name?" The girl looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something other than seriousness in her eyes. Hesitation, perhaps. "Luz," she whispered, her voice so soft he could barely hear it. "Luz, light." A name that seemed perfect for the small figure who had brought the first spark of hope into his darkness. "And where do you live?" "Luz." She just shook her head and tried to step around him. He knew he couldn't force her, couldn't scare her. He stepped aside, but as she passed, he had an idea. Discreetly, he pulled out his phone and, his heart aching with the feeling he was betraying her trust, snapped a quick photo as she walked away down the hall. The next day, he gave the photo to a private investigator, a discreet and efficient man he had used on a few occasions for corporate matters. "I want to know everything about her," Arthur said. "Where she lives, who her parents are, everything. But be discreet. Don't scare her. I don't want her to stop coming." While the investigator began his work, Arthur fell into a new routine. Luce appeared every day around 3 in the afternoon. She never explained where she came from or how she got in. She just appeared. She didn't talk much. She would sit beside Helena, sometimes humming her mysterious melody, other times just holding her hand in silence. And with every visit, Helena improved. They were small things, almost imperceptible to anyone but Arthur. A twitch in her fingers, a slight furrow of her brow, tiny signs that the woman he loved was, somehow, fighting her way back. 2 days later, the investigator called. "I found her, Mr. Sinclair. Her name is Luce Pereira. She lives with her grandmother, a woman named Clara, in a modest neighborhood across town." Arthur's relief was immense. She was real. She had a name, a home. He asked for the address, and that same afternoon, after Luce had left the hospital, he drove there. The neighborhood was a maze of narrow streets and simple houses, a world away from his mansion and the skyscrapers of the financial district. He found the small townhouse, its paint peeling, a pot of geraniums in the window. He took a deep breath and knocked. An elderly woman with white hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes that carried the weight of a hard life opened the door. Luce's grandmother, he presumed. "Can I help you?" she said, her voice gruff. "Good afternoon. My name is Arthur Sinclair. I believe I know your granddaughter, Luce," he said, trying to sound as gentle as possible. The instant he said his name, the woman's face transformed. The cautious politeness vanished, replaced by a mask of such cold, cutting hostility and resentment that it made Arthur take a step back. "We have nothing to say to you," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Stay away from my granddaughter. Stay away from my family." And before he could say another word, she slammed the door in his face. The sound of the door echoed on the quiet street, as final as a verdict. Arthur stood on the sidewalk, stunned by the raw, unexpected hostility. He had expected surprise, maybe suspicion, but not this visceral hatred. Why? What reason could this woman possibly have to hate him so intensely? He'd never seen her before in his life. He returned to his car, his mind a maelstrom of unanswered questions. The grandmother's reaction made no sense unless there was a prior connection, a history he wasn't part of. The mystery around Luce, which had once seemed magical and inexplicable, now took on a darker, more complex shape. There was a secret here, a secret that involved his family, his Helena, and somehow him. The next day, Luce didn't show up at the hospital. Arthur waited, his heart tight with anxiety at every car that passed, every footstep in the hall. 3 o'clock came and went. 4 o'clock. 5. The room felt quieter, colder without her presence. And with her absence, Helena's signs began to regress. The brain activity on the monitors diminished, the waves flattening back into their slow, desolate pattern. It was the confirmation he had feared. The connection was real, and the grandmother, with her inexplicable anger, had severed it. Desperate, he drove back to Clara's house. This time, he didn't knock. He stood across the street, watching, waiting. He saw Luce playing in the small backyard, throwing a ball against a wall. She looked like a normal, carefree child, but he saw a shadow of sadness on her shoulders. She missed the visits too. The grandmother appeared at the door, calling her inside in a stern voice. The door closed, and the house fell silent. Arthur knew he couldn't force it. Intimidating an old woman and a child was out of the question. He needed another approach. He returned to the hospital with a heavy heart. Helena's regression was more pronounced that night. It was like watching a flower bloom in slow motion and then suddenly seeing the film reversed, the petals closing, the color draining away. He held her hand, the cool plastic of the sensors between their skin. "I'll figure this out, my love," he whispered. "I promise, I'll figure out what's happening." The next morning, he focused on another piece of the puzzle, the maternal connection pattern. It was absurd, but it was the only scientific clue he had. He asked Dr. Mendez for access to all of Helena's medical records since they'd met. "I want everything, every appointment, every test, no matter how trivial it seems." The doctor, now an intrigued ally rather than a skeptic, agreed. Hours passed as Arthur and a nurse sifted through years of digital files, routine checkups, prescriptions for colds, an X-ray for a sprained wrist. Nothing. He was about to give up when the nurse frowned. "That's odd," she said. "There's an admission record from 5 years ago, the same week as her accident." Arthur's heart stopped. "An admission? But that's impossible. She was with me until the night of the accident." The nurse clicked a few times, her eyes fixed on the screen. "It's here, St. Mary's Hospital. A brief admission, 2 days. But the reason? It's marked confidential, sealed by court order." Confidential, court order. Why? The attending physician was listed, Dr. Alencar, an obstetrician. The word obstetrician hit Arthur with the force of a punch. He remembered that week. The week of the fight, of the accident. Helena had been acting strangely, a little distant. He'd chalked it up to work stress. She had said she needed to travel for 2 days for an art conference. Was it a lie? Why would she lie about going to a hospital? And why would she see an obstetrician? His mind refused to connect the dots, to accept the monstrous implication that was beginning to form. He picked up his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. He found Dr. Alencar's office. The receptionist was firm. He couldn't speak to the doctor without an appointment. Arthur wouldn't take no for an answer. "Tell him it's about Helena Caldwell. Tell him it's an emergency." He waited on hold, the sound of his own breathing loud in his ears. Finally, an older man's voice came on the line. "This is Dr. Alencar. What is this about Ms. Caldwell?" Arthur took a deep breath. "Doctor, I'm her husband. I just found out about an admission with you 5 years ago. I need to know why. She's in a coma, and this could be the key to everything." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a silence heavy with hesitation and professional ethics. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Sinclair," the doctor said finally, his voice full of regret. "But I cannot discuss a patient's chart, especially not this one. There is a court order prohibiting me from disclosing any details about that admission, especially to you." The phrase, "especially to you," echoed in Arthur's mind like the crack of a whip. It wasn't just generic medical protocol. It was personal. The court order existed specifically to keep him in the dark. The conversation ended there, with the doctor formally apologizing and hanging up. Arthur was left holding a dead phone, the hospital room seeming to shrink around him. Helena, his Helena, had a secret so big it involved doctors, hospitals, and judges, a secret from which she had deliberately excluded him. The pain of betrayal was a sharp knife, twisting in his chest, mingling with the guilt and confusion. Why? What reason could she have had to hide an obstetrician's visit from him? The most obvious answer was the most painful, a possibility his mind refused to accept. He spent the rest of the day and night in an agonizing fog, staring at his wife's serene face, which now looked like that of a stranger. Every familiar feature was tainted by this new doubt. Who was the woman with whom he had shared his life? Meanwhile, Lucy's absence continued to take its toll. Helena was regressing visibly. The small spark of consciousness the girl had ignited seemed to have been completely extinguished. Doctor. Mendez confirmed the regression with clinical data, the look on his face a mix of scientific frustration and human compassion. "It's undeniable, Arthur. The child's presence is the trigger. Without her, Helena's brain is going back to sleep." Those words were the catalyst Arthur needed. The pain and confusion gave way to a fierce determination. He didn't care about the secrets, about the grandmother's anger, or about court orders. The only thing that mattered was getting Helena back, and Luz was the key. He had to break the stalemate with Clara. He thought about using his power, his lawyers, but he knew force would only increase her resistance. There was something deeper here, a wound he needed to understand, not tear open. The next morning he returned to Clara's neighborhood, but this time he didn't knock on her door. He went to the small local market, the bakery, the pharmacy. He talked to people, not as the millionaire Arthur Sinclair, but just as a concerned man. He casually asked about the old woman in the townhouse, Clara, and her granddaughter. Slowly, between conversations about the weather and the price of bread, he pieced together a picture of their lives. Clara was a retired seamstress, living on a meager pension. She had raised her granddaughter alone since the girl was a baby. She was a tough, proud woman who rarely asked for help. Lutz was a quiet, smart child, loved by everyone in the neighborhood, but the most important piece came from a kind old woman in line at the convenience store. Poor Clara, she said, shaking her head, carried the world on her shoulders. Her daughter, little Luz's mother, she had such a sad fate. A terrible accident years ago left the girl an orphan before she was even really born. The word accident landed like a bomb in the silence of Arthur's mind. Everything clicked into place with a horrifying, devastating clarity. Lucy's mother, the terrible accident, the date, Clara's hostility, Helena's secret. They couldn't be coincidences. He got back in his car, heart hammering, his hands sweating on the steering wheel. He needed confirmation, one final piece of proof. He called his investigator. "I need you to find one more thing. Clara Pereira's daughter, Lucy's mother. What happened to her?" The wait for the answer was the longest of his life. An hour later, his phone rang. The investigator's voice was grave. Clara's daughter was named Helena Caldwell. "Sir, she didn't pass away. She's been in a coma for 5 years. At the same hospital as your wife." Arthur dropped the phone. The world tilted on its axis. There weren't two Helenas. There was only one, his Helena, and the girl, Luz, the child whose name meant light. That child was his daughter. The floor seemed to disappear from under him. He was a father. For 5 years, while he was drowning in self-pity and grief in the city's most expensive hospital room, his daughter was living a few miles away in a humble house, raised by a grandmother who hated him. The revelation brought no joy, only a new, crushing wave of guilt, deeper and more devastating than anything he had ever felt. Helena had been pregnant. That night, the night of the argument, she had been trying to tell him. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place in his mind with brutal clarity. Her strangeness in the days leading up to it, her insistence on talking about something important, the conference trip that was actually a visit to the obstetrician, and the argument, he remembered it now with a shame that burned in his gut. He'd been stressed about a deal, impatient. "Not now, Helena. Can't you see I'm busy?" he had said. He had refused to listen, and when she persisted, he had exploded, said things he didn't mean, and stormed out. She had gone after him, desperate to share the most important news of their lives, and he had led her straight into tragedy. The guilt was a living monster inside him, devouring any remnant of his sanity. He hadn't just caused the accident that put his wife in a coma. He had abandoned her at the moment she needed him most, and as a result, had abandoned a daughter he never knew existed. Clara's resentment now made perfect, terrible sense. In her eyes, he was the man who had destroyed her family. With the truth weighing like an anchor on his soul, he drove back to her house. This time, when he knocked, there was no arrogance or impatience, only the humility of a broken man. Clara opened the door, her face set like stone. Before she could speak, he said, his voice raw with emotion, "I know. Please, we need to talk." Perhaps she saw the devastation in his eyes, the naked truth of his suffering, because after a long, tense silence, she stepped aside and let him in. The small living room was simple but impeccably clean. Photos of Luz at various ages covered a small bookshelf. Clara didn't invite him to sit. She stood, arms crossed, a fortress of pain and anger. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cold. "I want to understand," he said. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Her laugh was short and bitter, devoid of humor. "Tell you, the man who put my daughter in that hospital bed, the man so wrapped up in his own world of money and deals that he couldn't spare 5 minutes for his own wife when she was carrying his child. For what? So you could take Luz from me too." Every word was a stab. "She was trying to tell me that night, wasn't she?" he asked, his voice a whisper. Clara nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She was so happy. She had just come from the doctor with the confirmation. She wanted to surprise you, but you wouldn't even look at her. She then told him the story of the last 5 years. How, in the chaos of the hospital after the accident, the doctors discovered the pregnancy and managed to perform an emergency delivery to save the premature baby as Helena slipped into a coma. How she, Clara, seeing his grief but also his blind anger at his own negligence, made a decision. She filed a petition in family court, using the fact they weren't legally married and proof of the argument as evidence of an unstable environment. She won temporary guardianship of her granddaughter and a sealed court order to protect the child from the man she blamed for her daughter's ruin. "I did what I had to do to protect the only piece of Helena I have left," she said, her voice breaking for the first time. "Luz is all I have." Just then, the bedroom door opened and Luz herself appeared, rubbing sleepy eyes. She saw Arthur, and a small smile touched her face. "Mister," she said, "you came." Arthur's heart shattered. His own daughter called him Mister. The word sounded more painful than any accusation Clara could ever make. Arthur looked at the little girl, his daughter, and saw Helena's eyes looking back at him. The same hazel color, the same slight tilt at the corners when she smiled. How could he have been so blind? His entire being cried out to hold her, to tell her who he was, but he knew he couldn't. Clara's warning gaze was a wall of ice. Luz, oblivious to the tension suffocating the room, walked toward him. "Are you taking us to see Mommy today?" The question, so innocent, was loaded with unbearable weight. Arthur swallowed hard, the lump in his throat tightening. He looked at Clara, a silent plea in his eyes. The old woman, seeing the devastated sincerity in his face and the hope in her granddaughter's, relented. It was a barely perceptible nod, a fragile truce born of mutual need. "Yes, sweetie," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're going to see Mommy." The ride to the hospital was silent. Luz sat in the back of the luxury car, gazing out the window with childlike curiosity, while Arthur and Clara occupied the front seats, separated by an abyss of 5 years of pain and secrets. When they arrived in the room, Luz's presence worked its usual magic. The monitors sprang to life, Helena's brainwaves blooming into complex patterns of activity. But this time, Arthur didn't just see an inexplicable miracle. He saw the primal connection between a mother and her child, a force of nature that science could barely begin to map. He watched Luz hold Helena's hand and hum her tune, and the ache in his chest was almost unbearable. He had been robbed of 5 years of his daughter's life, and he himself was the thief. In the following days, they established a fragile routine. Arthur would pick up Luz and Clara every afternoon. He would sit in his armchair, a spectator, while grandmother and granddaughter interacted with Helena. He learned about his daughter in fragments. He found out she loved to draw, that her favorite ice cream flavor was strawberry, and that she was afraid of the dark. Each small detail was both a treasure and a torture. Helena's improvement was slow, but steady. She began to move her fingers intentionally. One day, when Luz told a story about a scraped knee at school, Helena's brow furrowed in an unmistakable expression of concern. The doctors were amazed, calling it a case for the medical journals. But Arthur knew it wasn't medicine. It was love. It was the strength of a bond he himself had helped to sever. One afternoon, while Luce was napping on the room's small sofa and Clara had stepped out for coffee, Arthur was alone with Helena. The activity on the monitors was higher than ever. He took her hand, not as a grieving husband, but as a penitent. "Forgive me, Helena," he whispered, the tears finally rolling freely down his face. "I know everything. I know about Luce. I'm an idiot, a selfish fool. I abandoned you when you needed me most. I stole 5 years from the three of us. If you can hear me, please forgive me." He bowed his head, his body shaking with silent sobs. He felt a touch, faint, hesitant, but unmistakable. One of Helena's fingers moved, brushing the back of his hand. He shot his head up, heart racing. Her eyes were still closed, but her lips moved, a Herculean effort that strained the muscles in her neck. A sound escaped, a puff of air, a whisper shaped by the willpower of 5 years of silence. He leaned in, his ear inches from her mouth, holding his breath, and he heard it, a single word, fragile as glass, but clear as a bell. Luce, his daughter's name. The confirmation that she not only recognized the girl, but that the connection was conscious. Helena was in there. She always had been. And with her first word, she didn't accuse him, didn't blame him. She called for their daughter. The selflessness of that gesture, the purity of that maternal love, was Arthur's absolution and his condemnation, all in one devastating moment. The word hung in the air, a testament to a love that broke him in two. Helena was aware, not just reacting to stimuli, but aware. The implication hit him with the force of a tidal wave. For 5 years, she had been trapped inside her own body, a silent prisoner in a world of beeps and whispers. She had heard him. She had heard every daily confession of guilt, every lament, every empty promise. She had felt his hand, smelled the gardenias, and been able to do nothing. The suffering he had imagined for himself was a pale shadow of the torture she must have endured. That single whisper, their daughter's name, recontextualized everything. It wasn't just about her recovery, it was about her liberation. Arthur's guilt, already a crushing burden, morphed into something monstrous, almost paralyzing. He hadn't just caused the accident. He had sentenced her to 5 years of conscious solitary confinement. When Clara returned, he told her, his voice trembling. She spoke. She said Luce's name. The old woman's eyes filled with tears, the first he had ever seen her shed. The wall of anger she had maintained so staunchly began to crumble, replaced by a wave of shared relief and pain. In that moment, they weren't adversaries. They were just two people who loved Helena and wanted her back. The news galvanized the medical team. What was once an inexplicable phenomenon now had verbal confirmation. Therapy was intensified. Physical therapists, speech pathologists, and psychologists joined the team, all working around Luce's daily visits, which became the central axis of Helena's treatment. The girl, with her childlike intuition, seemed to understand her role. She would talk to her mother for hours, telling her about her day, showing her drawings, humming her special melody. And slowly, miraculously, Helena began to emerge from her silent cocoon. The first intentional movements were followed by more sounds, murmurs that gradually became words, thirsty, cold. Las. Each syllable was a victory, a marathon of neurological effort that left Helena exhausted but increasingly present. Arthur lived in a state of agonizing hope. The joy of seeing her return was overshadowed by the terror of what would happen when she could fully communicate. He both longed for and dreaded the moment her eyes would open and truly see him. Would she forgive him? How could she? He had failed her on every conceivable level. He tried to be the father he had never been. He brought Luce gifts, read her stories, helped her with her homework on the small sofa in the hospital room. The girl, with the resilience of children, began to accept him. Mr. was occasionally replaced by a hesitant Arthur. He knew he couldn't force a bond, that trust had to be earned, not bought. It was a long, arduous path, and he was willing to walk it, one step at a time. About a week after Helena's first word, she opened her eyes. Arthur was sitting beside the bed, watching her sleep. When her eyelids fluttered and lifted, her brown eyes, a little cloudy from disuse, slowly came into focus. They scanned the white room, the monitors, and finally, they landed on him. There was no accusation, no anger, not even surprise, just a deep weariness, a sadness that seemed to come from the soul, and recognition. She saw him. She knew who he was. Arthur's heart stopped. He wanted to say a million things, to apologize a million times, but the words wouldn't come. He just stared back. His heart laid bare and vulnerable. Helena raised her hand, a slow, trembling gesture. He took it, feeling the faint warmth of her skin. Her lips moved, and this time her voice was a little stronger, a clear whisper. "It wasn't your fault." The words were a gift, an absolution he didn't deserve. But before he could absorb the impact of that unearned forgiveness, she continued, each word a struggle. "It was mine. I was running." Her words hit him with the force of a revelation, undoing the narrative of guilt he had constructed for 5 years. "Running? Running from what?" he asked, his voice a bewildered whisper. The effort to speak was immense for Helena. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering strength. When she opened them again, there was a depth of pain in them he had never seen before. "From him," she whispered, and the name that followed was that of her father. A powerful and controlling man Arthur had always loathed. He found out about the baby. The story unspooled in painful fragments, told over several hours with long pauses for Helena to catch her breath. She revealed that her father, an inflexible traditionalist, had been furious when he learned of the out-of-wedlock pregnancy. He had threatened her, not physically, but in a way that was much worse. He threatened to use his influence to destroy Arthur's career, to ensure he lost everything. He threatened to disinherit her and make sure she and the baby had nothing. He gave her an ultimatum: terminate the pregnancy or face complete ruin, not just for herself, but for the man she loved. On that fateful night, Helena wasn't just trying to tell Arthur about the baby. She was panicking. She wanted to tell him, but she also wanted to protect him from her father's wrath. His impatience, his refusal to listen, was the last straw for her panicked state. When he stormed out, she didn't go after him just to reconcile. She got in the car to run away, to go to her mother's house, to Clara's, the only safe harbor she knew. She was driving recklessly, her eyes blurred with tears, her mind a whirlwind of fear and desperation when the truck appeared. The accident wasn't Arthur's fault. It was the result of one man's cruelty and a daughter's desperation. Arthur felt the ground of his reality reconfigure itself once more. The guilt that had defined him for 5 years dissolved, not into relief, but into a cold, incandescent rage directed at Helena's father. He had spent 5 years hating himself, while the true villain of the story had lived his life, free of consequence. As Helena recovered physically, the real challenge became emotional. She had to deal with the trauma of 5 years of imprisoned consciousness and the pain of her father's actions. Arthur, for his part, faced a new challenge: how to be a father to a daughter who barely knew him and a partner to a woman who was relearning how to live. And there was the question of Luce, how to explain to her that Mr. was actually her father. They decided, with the help of psychologists, that the truth should come gradually and gently. Arthur began to be a part of Luce's routine, not just at the hospital, but at home. He took her to the park, helped Clara with the groceries, fixed the leaky faucet. He was trying to build a foundation of trust, showing with actions, not words, that he was there to stay. The moment of greatest tension came weeks later. Helena was in a wheelchair, her speech almost fully recovered, though her body was still weak. She was about to be discharged to continue her rehabilitation at home, a home Arthur was frantically adapting for her needs. The night before her discharge, an unexpected complication arose. Helena developed a high fever and had difficulty breathing. The doctors feared pneumonia, a potentially life-threatening condition for someone in her weakened state. The improvement that had seemed so miraculous suddenly became fragile, threatened. The possibility of losing her again, after just getting her back, was an unspeakable terror for Arthur. He was sitting by her bed, holding her hand, when Luce, sensing the tension in the air, came closer. "Is Mommy going to be okay?" she asked, her big eyes worried. Arthur looked at his daughter, his heart heavy with uncertainty. He had to be strong for her, but he could feel his own hopes crumbling. How could he promise something the doctors couldn't guarantee? Arthur looked into his daughter's eyes, a mirror of Helena's, and knew he couldn't offer false platitudes. He pulled her onto his lap, her small, warm body against his. "The doctors are doing everything they can, sweetie," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his heart. "Your mum is the strongest woman I know, and she has the best reason in the world to fight. She has you." Luce leaned her head against his shoulder, a silent acceptance of his comfort. In that moment, they weren't just a man and his beloved's daughter. They were a father and a daughter, united in their worry for the woman they both loved. The night was long. Arthur and Clara kept a silent vigil as the doctors worked. Helena's fever fluctuated, and the monitors, which had once sung the song of her return, now sounded notes of alarm and uncertainty. Arthur felt the old despair creeping back in, the sense of helplessness in the face of life's fragility. But something was different this time. He wasn't alone. He looked at Clara, asleep in the armchair, her wrinkled face softened by sleep, and at Luz, who slept on a makeshift bed. And he felt a strength that came not from money or power, but from connection. At dawn, the chief resident entered the room, his face tired but with a restrained smile. "The crisis has passed. The antibiotics are working. Her fever is coming down. She's going to be okay." The relief was so overwhelming that Arthur felt his knees go weak. He hugged Clara, an embrace of gratitude and kinship forged in the fire of that night. The crisis, though terrifying, had served as a catalyst. It solidified the fragile unity they were building. When Helena awoke, weak but lucid, and saw the three anxious faces around her, she smiled. A genuine smile, the first they had seen in more than 5 years. 2 weeks later, Helena was discharged. Arthur took her not to the cold mansion they had shared, filled with painful memories, but to a new home he had bought, a warmer place, with a large garden, fully adapted for her rehabilitation. Clara and Luce moved in with them. The townhouse was sold, and its small living room was recreated in a corner of the new house, complete with Luce's photos and Clara's old sewing armchair, a sanctuary of their past lives within the new one. Helena's recovery was a slow, arduous process. There were days of frustration and pain, but also days of progress and joy. Arthur was by her side every step of the way, learning to be a caregiver, a partner, and a father, all at once. He rediscovered the woman he loved, not the idealized version he had kept in his memory, but the real woman, with her incredible strength, her vulnerability, and her sharp humor that, little by little, began to return. The matter of Helena's father was resolved quietly and definitively. Arthur used his influence not to destroy the man, as Helena's father had threatened to do to him, but to ensure he could never harm them again. Legal agreements were drawn up, guaranteeing the financial and personal security of Helena, Clara, and Luce in exchange for his silence and distance. It wasn't revenge, it was protection. Forgiveness was something Helena would have to address in her own time. The greatest transformation, however, was the relationship between Arthur and Luz. With the truth gently revealed by Helena, the little girl went through a period of confusion, but the love and stability surrounding her helped her understand. One day, as they were playing in the garden, Luce tripped and fell. Arthur rushed to help her up. As he lifted her, she hugged him tightly, and with her face buried in his shirt, she said the word he had longed to hear for an eternity. Daddy. The word, spoken with the simplicity of a child finally finding her place in the world, healed a wound in Arthur he hadn't known ran so deep. He held her back, the tears he could never shed for himself now flowing freely for his daughter. In that moment, in the warmth of the sun-drenched garden, surrounded by the smell of damp earth and roses, redemption was no longer an abstract concept, but a tangible, warm reality in his arms. Their journey wasn't over, but the hardest part was behind them. Helena's rehabilitation would continue for many months, perhaps years. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But the foundation of their new life was solidly built on truth, forgiveness, and an unconditional love that had been tested under the most impossible circumstances. They had become a family, not a perfect storybook family, but a real one, forged in pain and rebuilt by the resilience of the human spirit. Clara, the fiercely protective grandmother, transformed into a loving matriarch, her old bitterness softened by the joy of seeing her daughter and granddaughter flourish. She and Arthur developed a mutual respect, a silent bond of those who had survived the same storm. Arthur, the broken millionaire, discovered that his vast fortune couldn't buy happiness, but it could provide the security and comfort that allowed love to heal. He learned that true wealth wasn't in his bank statements, but in his daughter's laughter, the touch of his wife's hand, and the quiet wisdom of his mother-in-law. He slowed down, sold off parts of his business, and dedicated his time to what truly mattered. Helena, the woman who had returned from the abyss, found a strength she never knew she possessed. She was no longer defined by the accident or the trauma, but by her capacity to forgive and love. She looked at Arthur, not with the memory of the pain he had indirectly caused, but with gratitude for the man he had become. She looked at her daughter, the miracle child who had brought her back to life, and she saw the future. And Luce, the little key to the whole mystery, blossomed. The seriousness in her eyes gave way to a constant gleam of joy. She had a mother who adored her, a grandmother who protected her, and finally, a father who loved her unconditionally. The melody she hummed, as neuroscientists later theorized, was likely a song Helena had sung to her while she was still in the womb, a prenatal connection imprinted on both their brains, a secret language between them that no technology could ever fully replicate or understand. 6 weeks after that rainy, melancholic afternoon in the hospital, the scene was unrecognizable. Spring sunlight streamed into the garden of the new house. Arthur gently pushed Helena's wheelchair along a stone path, while Luce ran ahead, chasing a blue butterfly. The smell of disinfectant had been replaced by the perfume of flowers. The rhythmic beep of the monitors had been traded for the sound of a child's laughter. Helena reached out and touched Arthur's face. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and strong, "but not giving up." "I would never give up on you," he replied, kissing her hand. Luce, abandoning her butterfly chase, ran back to them. She threw herself into her father's arms, and he lifted her into the air. "Daddy, push me on the swing." Helena watched them, her heart overflowing. The hospital room that had for 5 years echoed with solitary monologues of guilt was now a distant memory, a symbol not of despair, but of the beginning of a miracle. The real healing hadn't come from medicine or technology, but from the inexplicable primal power of a family that, even when broken, had found its way back home.